foreign policy in the late 20th century. He passed away 2 years ago at age 100 after distinguished careers not only in government but also academia and business. Best known for his 6.5 years as Secretary of State in the Reagan administration, he took office in mid-1982 with a vision for easing Cold War tensions. Although he was an embattled figure at the State Department, often at odds with anti-Soviet ideologues in the administration, Shultz was eventually able to forge a very strong relationship with Ronald Reagan and helped negotiate landmark arms control treaties and other agreements that led to diminished U.S.-Soviet tensions. But Phil makes clear at the outset of his book that we should care about Shultz not just for what he accomplished, but how. Shultz was, as Phil says, a model of quiet, effective leadership. And he was a model of public service, characterized, again quoting Phil, by common sense, trust, a human touch, openness to new ideas, and the muting of ideology, partisanship, and hostilities, partisanship and histrionics. Shultz's story has enduring meaning for us today as we grapple with intensified polarization and look for ways to mend divisions. Phil's an excellent fit to chronicle and assess Shultz's life. He reported on Shultz at times in the 1980s and during his own nearly 30 years with the New York Times as a reporter and editor, he specialized in national security affairs, including a stint as a Moscow bureau chief when Shultz was Secretary of State. After leaving the Times in 2008, Phil landed at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. At the invitation of Shultz, who also was at Stanford, Phil agreed after a while to write the biography and was granted exclusive access to Shultz's papers. And Phil also gained access to a detailed diary written by a close insider chronicling Shultz's first years as Secretary of State. As much as Phil portrays Shultz as an accomplished, influential, and sensible leader, he also doesn't shy away from detailing Shultz's shortcomings, his blind spots, and unflattering aspects. All in all, In the Nation's Service is a deeply researched, revealing, and insightful work that adds significantly not only to our understanding of Shultz, but also of his times. In conversation with Phil this evening will be Bob Woodward, who during his long career covering Washington has had his own experiences with Shultz. Bob has broken countless stories during his more than 50 years that he's been associated with the Washington Post. He's shared in 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for his Watergate coverage and the other for his coverage of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And he's authored 21 national best-selling books, 15 of which have been #1 New York Times bestsellers, which is a hell of a record. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Philip Taubman and Bob Woodward.
Thank you, Brad. Is this on? Yep, that was a very nice introduction. Appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. It's great when you write a book to show up at an event like this and see so many people. It's a very satisfying feeling, so thank you all for coming.
The real satisfaction, though, is having everyone buy a copy. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. This is...
I was leaving that to you, Bob.
Yeah, yes. Well, it's great to be here and to see you again. I have said on the back of this book that it's a masterpiece, and in my view, it really is. You should feel good about it. I want to go back and tell quickly a personal story. It was the fall of 1982, and Shultz had just come as Secretary of State, and I was at one of those dreadful press dinners. This was 40 years ago, so I was young, and I would go to things like that. I was seated next to Obie Shultz, George Shultz's wife of then, I think, 36 years, she had been a lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps in World War II. They met in the Philippines, were married right after the war, and by every account, this was a marriage that worked very close. And so I thought, understanding of what was going on, I said to her, "So why did your husband come to Washington?" I mean, there was this right-wing group of Casey, Poindexter, the National Security Advisor, Clark, who were all so anti-Soviet. And she said, well, he came to make peace with the Soviet Union. And I laughed and explained that, that certainly wasn't going to work, and what was the plan? And she said, my husband is a determined man. And I believed that at the time, and I was, of course, wrong, and never been happier to be wrong, because what George Shultz did, I knew at the time somewhat, but not until I read your book did I understand Shultz, and particularly what he did with the Soviet Union. So tell us that story, because that's the most important part of this book that has many important parts.
Well, before I do that, though, I have to tell you all how I first encountered Bob. I was a young reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, and the bureau chief had summoned me into his office a few days before and said, "Phil, we want you to cover the intelligence community." And I said, "What?" I was covering the Justice Department at the time. I said, "Okay." Literally 2 days later, I went home. My wife was working at the Washington Post at the time, Felicity Barringer. And as the evening wore on, I said to her, she was an editor, so she saw the front page dummy of what was going to be on the front page of the Post the next day. As the evening wore on, I said, "I'm going to go to bed. I'm tired." She said, "I'm not sure you want to do that." Make a long story short, Bob had an exclusive piece stripped across the top of the front page about intelligence issues. And so at 11 o'clock at night, I was expected to match you. That's how my Washington journalism career at the New York Times started.
Okay, let's get back to your book.
So back to Shultz.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a moving and a story that everyone needs to understand. So give us the long version.
So the bottom line is George Shultz did come to Washington to try to wind down the Cold War, as audacious as that might sound, especially in the administration that he was coming to work in. And at the beginning of his term as Secretary of State, as you'll see in the book, he ran into a wall of opposition from Reagan advisors. Bill Clark, the National Security Advisor, Bill Casey, the Director of Central Intelligence, Cap Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, etc. And he kept trying to get time with the President of the United States to talk about U.S.-Soviet relations. And every time he was invited to the White House to do that, he'd walk into the Oval Office or the Cabinet Room, And he would find all his opponents there ready to pounce on him. So for the first 2 years of his time as secretary, it was very hard for him to get traction. But George had a couple of native skills or impulses that I think served him very well. He was a very patient man. He listened very well. There are not a lot of high officials in Washington, in my experience, who listen well. They always have a lot to say, but they don't listen well. He listened a lot to what he was hearing. And eventually, very importantly, he befriended Nancy Reagan. And it was Nancy Reagan who really made the breakthrough for George Shultz on a snowy night here in the Capitol. Some of you may remember it. February 1983. It snowed 2 to 3 feet here that night, that day, and the Reagans were expecting to go to Camp David for the weekend. They couldn't make it, believe it or not. The president couldn't get to Camp David. Flying conditions were terrible, driving impossible. So Nancy Reagan picked up the phone and called the Shultzes and said, how about coming over to dinner tonight at the family residence, which they did. And it was at that dinner that the Secretary of State and the President had their first head-to-head conversation about U.S.-Soviet relations.
And what'd they say?
And it was at that night that he realized Reagan also wanted to wind down the Cold War. Remember, Reagan administration began with this incredibly harsh rhetoric about the Soviet Union and the massive military buildup at the Defense Department. Evil empire, communism will wind up on the ash heap of history. So Shultz wasn't quite sure what to make of Reagan until that night. And as they sat there in the family quarters, Reagan kept asking him, Shultz had just come back from China. Tell me about the Chinese leaders. Tell me about the Soviet leaders.
From Reagan.
From Reagan was asking him. And at a certain point, Shultz said to himself, wait a minute, this guy has never met a big-time communist leader, and he wants to meet one. So I won't go into the details, but that led to the beginning of negotiations. It took a long time.
Okay,
but
now
that was really the beginning of the end of the Cold War that night.
Yes, I mean, and did Nancy Reagan, I mean, it was this Deaver, or who was this winding her up and saying, get George Shultz in there to talk to them?
It was Nancy and Deaver and Jim Baker. They were worried about Reagan's reputation. They were worried he was going to go down in history as a warmonger.
Okay, this is a little bit of a metaphysical question, but was Shultz trying to help Reagan discover who he was, or was Shultz trying to convince Reagan, you can really be George Shultz also?
Well, the way I would put it is he really wanted, first of all, to understand what Reagan wanted, which he didn't know until that evening. And secondly, he wanted Reagan to be Reagan, which in his mind was very different. In that era, that was a common phrase you heard in Washington. Let Reagan be Reagan. That meant let him go after the Kremlin. Let him be belligerent. Let him be tough. What Shultz realized was letting Reagan be Reagan was letting Reagan search for peace.
Okay, now what is the big achievement here? Reagan and Shultz with the Soviet Union.
So, winding down the Cold War.
In what way, though?
Well,
Tell us, remind us what that meant.
So, you got to recall that when Reagan came into the White House, it was just in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And U.S.-Soviet relations were basically in a ditch. Jimmy Carter had decided to cut off communication with the Kremlin. You may remember he also banned the United States Olympic team from participating in the Moscow Olympics in 1980. And so, the idea, you first have to get negotiations going. There was a meeting that George, when he took office, he was confirmed. Now, here's an interesting fact. In
You know,
today's
this
Washington-
always happens to biographers. They start calling their subject
Yes,
by his first name.
I do. But I want to make clear one thing,
Okay.
which you'll read in the
And
book.
you knew him.
When I agreed to do the book, I said, George, this is a very simple formula for this book. It's your life, but it's my book. And by that I meant I'm going to write an independent biography, and if that's not what you want, you better get a different biographer.
Oh, but you're lucky it came out after he was dead.
Yes, we'll never know really what he thought about the book.
Yeah, but how did you persuade? I mean, did you literally say to him, "Your life, my book"?
Those were the very words I spoke.
And what did he say?
He said, I agree. It was that simple.
And that's after he invited you into his archive at Stanford. Is that right? Or did you break in?
No. So the archive is interesting. When Shultz turned his papers over to the Hoover Institution at Stanford, it was on the understanding that they would remain sealed until his death. So they were closed. What he offered me was exclusive access to those papers.
Why? Why?
Because he knew that they would be helpful in writing his biography.
But how did you approach him to say, "I want to be your biographer"?
Oh, no, he came to me.
He came to you?
Yes, he came to me.
Were you suspicious?
Well, by that point, I was two-thirds of the way through a book about George and Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry and Sam Nunn, about their effort to eliminate nuclear weapons. And when he came to me, perfect Stanford moment, it was before the big game between Stanford and the University of California at Berkeley. We were at a big luncheon. He pulls me into the corner and says, Phil, what's your next project? I said, I don't know. He said, how about writing my biography? So
Just like that.
Exactly like that, yeah. And so, you know, before I agreed...
Did he say why he picked you?
No.
Did you ask, why are you picking me?
No. You know, my assumption...
Did you wonder?
No, my assumption was he knew I'd written about him when he was Secretary of State. He knew that I was an independent journalist. I think he understood that the best biography that could be done was not a court biography, but a biography by an independent writer who would talk about the strengths and weaknesses of George Shultz, because that would be more credible than a biography that was a hagiography.
Okay, because some of us in the same business don't have that experience.
Yeah, did you tell Richard Nixon, it's your life but my book?
I wish I'd thought of that at the time. But I mean, it's very interesting. The other thing that is really important for people here to understand is the depth and extent of, you worked on this book 7 years, right?
Right.
At full-time?
Not full-time. Unlike authors like you who are constant bestsellers, authors like me have to make a living. And I made a living working at Stanford in the office of the president, whom I knew. I am a Stanford graduate. And he brought me aboard and said, I want you to help me run the university in certain areas. I was flattered by the offer. It was not to do public affairs. I wasn't going to be a PR person. So I ended up as secretary of the Stanford Board of Trustees for 7 years. And that's how I made a living as I worked on the book, but it distracted me from the book.
Well, at Stanford, they say the book distracted you from working on all of the other
Right.
things. Okay, but now you use the term winding down the Cold War. Put some meat on that bone. Because, I mean, this is 1983, this famous dinner, which you describe so vividly. You are there and you realize that Nancy Reagan's up to something. And Shultz realizes that. And Obie realizes that, I suspect, to a certain extent. And so the end of the Cold War was another 6 years away. So take us through the stations of the cross that got us to the end of the Reagan presidency.
Well, first you have to get through the aged Soviet leadership. We'll never know whether George Shultz and Ronald Reagan, even with the impulse to try to wind down the Cold War, could have done it. Had Brezhnev continued to live. He was replaced by Yuri Andropov, former KGB leader. Again, we'll never know what would have happened. And then Andropov died and was replaced by a very aged Konstantin Chernenko. And during this period, U.S.-Soviet relations were basically at a standstill. It was partly because of the ossification in the Kremlin, but it was also because Shultz hadn't really been able to get much traction in Washington. March '85, bingo, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes Kremlin leader. That was the critical turning point.
And did Shultz realize that? Was he saying to himself or to OB or whoever he was talking to then, we're on that path?
Well, he went to Moscow for several funerals of these deceased Soviet leaders. When he went to Chernenko's funeral, Gorbachev met with him. Vice President Bush was there too. And they talked for about an hour in the Kremlin. And after the meeting, as Shultz recorded himself and told me, he understood there'd been a sea change in the leadership of the Kremlin. And, I was based there at the time. I had just gotten to Moscow in the fall of '85, so it was just a few months after this. And the signs of change were becoming evident, but it wasn't clear yet how far Gorbachev would try to go to change Soviet policies domestically and foreign. But Shultz came out of that meeting, and when the Canadian Prime Minister asked him at the Kremlin after the memorial service, said, George, when do you think the Kremlin is going to change? When are their policies going to change? He said to Mulroney, they just changed. So he recognized the potential in Gorbachev.
Okay, so what was the biggest, accomplishment? What is the treaty, the agreement, the moment when the change that took 6 years at least was cemented?
Well, I think there are two moments I would talk about, and believe me, there are a lot of steps along the way that led to these things. The agreement that sort of signaled that things were changing profoundly was the treaty to eliminate intermediate range missiles, which carried nuclear warheads. And the Soviet Union had placed these missiles in the western territory of the Soviet Union, and the United States was placing them in West Germany. And the agreement that Reagan and Gorbachev and Shultz and the Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, made was to eliminate those missiles. That agreement was signed here in Washington in 1987. So that was a critical moment. But I would say that the atmospherics of that Gorbachev visit to Washington also, if I had to point to the end of the Cold War, I think it would have been on the sidewalks of Washington during that visit.
Now, explain that scene, because that's quite an amazing moment.
We were here. I had flown in from Moscow to cover the event. And many of you probably witnessed this yourselves. Gorbachev was treated here as a hero. And as his motorcade made its way around downtown Washington, there were tens of thousands of Washingtonians lining the sidewalks to see him and cheer him. And he stopped at the corner of K and Connecticut, got out of his limo, and started mixing with the crowd on the sidewalk like some presidential candidate, working the rope line at a campaign event. To me, that was the moment the Cold War ended.
I see. Yeah, anyone here who was there that day? Really? Yes. I think you were yet unconceived. Okay, but there's a lot of history in that. No, we're going to have to do questions formally from the microphone, or Brad Graham will throw us out. Now, I think another important turning point in Shultz's life when he reached this agreement in 2007 with Kissinger to write an article in the Wall Street Journal, of all places, saying we need to abolish all nuclear weapons. How did that come about?
Well, that for those of you who want to buy 2 books tonight, if Brad has them handy, that's the subject of my previous book called The Partnership, 5 Cold Warriors and Their Quest to Ban the Bomb. So that was an amazing, implausible thing to think of these 4 men, all stellar Cold Warriors, who had come to the realization by 2006 that nuclear weapons should be abolished. And then they led a campaign that lasted for several years that seemed to make headway for a while, and then it kind of ran out of gas, I'm sad to say, in the Obama administration. Obama gave a stirring speech in Prague just a couple of months after his inauguration, and it was a speech calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And then he went to the UN, and he led a Security Council vote on abolishing nuclear weapons. But sad, he got distracted by other things, and he let the momentum sort of out of the balloon.
Yeah, but I mean, you know enough military people who really think it's not practical to abolish nuclear weapons.
Well, that's an interesting debate. You know, there's certainly a school of thought that if you give up nuclear weapons, then you're going to invite aggression. And how do you really know that the Russians have given up their nuclear arsenal, or the North Koreans? It's a vexed and very complicated issue. But I left that project, that book, convinced there is a road to abolition. It would take many years, but unfortunately at this point the road hit a dead end.
Okay, now what's in all of your research, what's the biggest mistake Shultz made in his life, either officially or in his personal life?
Well, he made a number, and I think that you all here, the first one that probably comes to your mind is Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. That was a tragic misjudgment on his part.
Explain.
So he was in his 90s, and he liked to look over the horizon and spot developments or breakthroughs that might improve the world. And Elizabeth Holmes went to him, Stanford dropout, and said, I've got this new technology.
Is there a difference between a Stanford dropout and a graduate?
I'm going to let that one go.
That was your way of saying she wasn't qualified,
well,
right?
Who knows?
Okay.
At any rate, he became persuaded that this technology, just, take a drop of blood from a finger and put it through her magic machine, and you could diagnose all kinds of ailments. And it would save you from getting a blood draw, and having it go off to Quest or one of the other labs, and et cetera. He fervently believed in this technology, and she...
Was he in love with Elizabeth Holmes?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
I think he started by fervently believing in the technology as a game changer. And he was also bedazzled and enthralled by Elizabeth Holmes, who I believe in a very calculating way courted George Bush to be her sponsor.
You mean George Shultz?
George Bush, sorry. George Shultz, excuse me. And he recruited her board of directors, which included a lot of big names in American national security, not a single person who knew anything about the biomedical world. And then he helped get her on the cover of Forbes and Fortune. I do think...
And she gave him 2 million shares of stock, is that right?
A lot of people ask, why did he stick with her after his grandson came to him and said, George, this is a fraud. And instead of embracing and hugging his grandson Tyler and saying, I'll sever relations
And
with her.
his grandson was working for
Working at
Elizabeth
Theranos,
Holmes.
yes.
And he saw that it was a fraud.
He saw it was a fraud.
And went to George Shultz and blew the whistle.
And George wouldn't hear of it.
Yeah, why?
Because he believed in Elizabeth Holmes. And I think there are two reasons, several, but you talked about money. It turned out that she had given him stock that at the peak of the valuation of Theranos was worth $50 million. So George Shultz was a wealthy man, but $50 million can turn anyone's head. And secondly, I think that he was infatuated with her. And it was something I could see when I visited him, and she would show up at dinners. And she was, I think, courting him.
Okay. So, and so he chose her over his grandson, who was Tyler, right? Who was was into the weeds at.
Yeah, he was working there because his grandfather had told him what a great company it was and helped him get a job there.
And there's that moment where Tyler went to him and said what? And what
he
did
said,
George
"I'm in trouble, Grandpa. They think I'm talking to the Wall Street Journal," which in fact he was, but it wasn't a publicly established fact yet. And they've hired lawyers and private investigators who are, pursuing me. I need your help. And Shultz had arranged for a couple of David Boyes's colleagues, he was representing Theranos, to wait upstairs at his house for this meeting. I believe he thought that they would come downstairs and offer a peace agreement with Tyler, but what actually happened is they came downstairs and they presented a desist order to Tyler, and instead of backing his grandson, he backed Elizabeth Holmes. So it was a very tragic kind of end of his life.
Okay. Now, I checked the index of your book on Shultz, and I noticed that there are 40 entries under the New York Times and only 10 under the Washington Post. Is that because you worked for the New York Times, or is that because the New York Times did a more important job covering Shultz?
Most of the New York Times citations come from the time when I was in Moscow. And so actually a lot of them were stories that I wrote, that my wife wrote, that my colleague here, Serge Schmemann, wrote. And so, I was falling back on familiar territory.
Oh, that wasn't a way of dissing the Post.
No,
Because one of the most interesting stories is Shultz goes to the Post for an interview, or somebody at the Post interviews him, and at the end of the interview says to Shultz, "You don't seem very happy." And go ahead.
well, just to finish up on I'm a great admirer of David Remnick, who was in the Moscow bureau of the Washington Post, and Michael Dobbs, and other correspondents there. So it was not an effort to diminish the Washington Post. But to go to your question.
I mean, but Schultz's response to that question of "you don't seem happy" was, "I did not come here to be happy."
Right. This was
Now,
a
explain
point,
that.
Well, this was a point at which he was getting mighty frustrated at getting shut out of the Oval Office. And it began to show in public appearances, including some Senate testimony that he gave. And the journalists, Mary McGrory among them, started writing columns and stories saying he doesn't look very happy. He's beginning to act like Al Haig, who had been his predecessor as Secretary of State, who was very intemperate at times. So that's
happy. I know a lot about Al Haig, and
Haig.
he was a happy man when he was in charge.
Yeah, well, he was not so happy when he was fired.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Okay. Well, that. So, who was your best source? And how did you discover that source or person or trove of documents? Because for people who research, I think universal experience is it's not necessarily what you expect or where you expect to find that good source. Is that in this case true?
Well, to go back to why I did the book, this is an answer to your question. Shultz gave me access to his archive to help me decide whether to write the book. And I'd been down in the archive room reading room at the Hoover Institution, and I noticed a journal in the registry of materials that had been maintained by his executive assistant for the first 2+ years he was Secretary of State. That gentleman was Raymond Seitz, who then went on to become ambassador to Great Britain. That was the reason I wrote the book, and I think it is the key source of information for the book. Ray Seitz, this is the way it worked. He kept detailed handwritten notes every day about everything that George Shultz did. And when Shultz came back...
And that Shultz said, which was much more important.
I'm about to say, he came back from meetings and vented to Seitz about his feelings. Seitz was a very acute observer and a very elegant writer. He wrote this down in stenographic pads, and then his secretary typed them up. He never told Shultz he was doing it, because in his mind, once he told the Secretary of State he was doing it, it was prima facie property of the U.S. government, would be stamped top.
Oh, do you believe that reason?
I do, because it's full of classified information.
Oh, I'm shocked. Imagine that. Was it stamped top secret?
No, that's the point.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll get to what's going on today.
His secretary typed it up. He walked out of the State Department with it in his briefcase, and it's sitting there at the Hoover Institution, and I had exclusive access to it. And it is one of the most extraordinary documents of the modern American presidency and of the Cold War.
And at what point of your research did you discover this?
I discovered it before I agreed to do the book.
Oh, you had?
Yes. And then I relied heavily on it while I was doing the book.
So did you tell Shultz, I'm not sure I want to do the book, and then when you got something good, did you go to him and said, I've got something good now?
Well, no,
you didn't tell him.
I did. I didn't tell him about the diary when I agreed to do the book, but he surely knew I was going to find it down there.
Did you ever talk to him about it, Shultz?
Actually, no. I talked at great lengths to Ray Seitz about it.
Yeah, but not Shultz.
No.
How about with Obie?
She was long since dead when I was working on the book.
I see. Okay. So that's, I kind of would want to know, if I were George Shultz, that my executive assistant was keeping this detailed.
I think he used it in his own book.
You do?
There are no fingerprints in his book, Turmoil and Triumph, which is a 1,000-page opus about his times.
1,100 pages.
Yes.
I mean, my God.
When I decided to do the book, I called an old friend of mine, whom you probably knew, Richard Reeves, the journalist, who was a good friend. And I said, Dick, I'm going to do a book about a biography of George Shultz. And he said, good. That means that you and I will be the only two people in America to read his book in full.
Yes, what was the review the New York Times gave to Shultz's book?
It was not flattering.
No, it was not. It's something, I think the word dreary was in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, if you want a moment-by-moment regurgitation of the Reagan administration foreign policy, that's your book.
Yeah. Okay, now, I spent some time writing about the CIA director, Bill Casey.
Indeed you did. Indeed you did.
And I kind of concluded in the book I wrote about him called Veil that he was the shadow Secretary of State. Do you think that was right or not?
He certainly wanted to be, and he used all his influence, which was quite considerable, to try to thwart Shultz on U.S.-Soviet relations.
And on other things.
Other things, but
like Central America,
yeah, Central America,
like terrorism,
right, across the board.
And I kind of concluded that Casey used the CIA as a policy planning apparatus for himself, and then implemented it through the CIA. And when he needed, he finally went to the White House and the National Security Council and McFarland and all these figures from the Iran-Contra. And I noticed you don't give Casey much ink.
No, he's there. He's an important figure, and
boy, the New York Times entries were 40, and I think there were only about 6 for Casey.
Well, I couldn't find a journal maintained by Casey's executive assistant, they were at loggerheads constantly, and there's a great moment which I allude to in the book, but I can be a little more explicit about here. So in the summer of '83, Casey and Cap Weinberger and the other hardliners went around Shultz. Shultz was traveling, and got Reagan to agree to a series of steps to increase U.S. covert military and intelligence operations in Central America. At the time, I was handed a series of documents by a source I can't identify even now that was all the decisions that Reagan had made. And I broke those decisions in the New York Times over a course of 3 days on the front page. What I didn't know at the time was the Secretary of State was learning about what had happened from my stories. And I discovered this in the Site's Journal, where this is the moment, probably one of the lowest ebbs for Shultz. He discovers all these decisions have been made. He's opposed to them. He wasn't consulted about them. He's reading about them in the New York Times, and he's furious.
Did he blame you?
Who knows?
Well, often people do.
Could well have blamed me. I don't know.
I mean, is there anything in that diary about that effing Taubman?
Now, my name is in there, but without the F word.
Really? Well, okay. Good. Should we turn to questions now?
Absolutely.
But is there anything you think is important to? I'm very taken with. Suppose somebody, one of the young people, comes to you, and I'm thinking of writing a book about, let's, pick somebody. Jim Mattis, who was Trump's Secretary of Defense. And what advice would you give them about hurdles that you want to make sure you get over? And what would be the timing, and when do you make the commitment? And you didn't sign a contract with Shultz, did you? So I'm. Let's pretend I'm 28, and I come to you and said, "Oh, Mr. Taubman, I've read your book and read all about you, read your 3 books, and I need advice about the method."
I think it's very simple. You know it better than I do. Just the words, it's one word repeated over and over again. Research, research, research. Reporting, reporting, reporting. A book is only as good as the research that goes into it.
Yeah, and only as good as the sources. Now, Shultz talked much about trust and how important trust was, and he was a trusting person. But it also made him timid at times, didn't it? And did you ever square it? Because you did lots of interviews with him. Mm-hmm. Did you ever say to him, "Hey, George, give me a little Encyclopedia Britannica on trust and how you used it and how actually people used it against you"?
So we spent a lot of time talking about 2 words, trust and timidity. And I think the timidity side is important, and you'll find that in the book. There's a chapter about Shultz's involvement in, of all things, Bob Woodward, Watergate, where he famously said he would not, at the time he was Secretary of the Treasury, and the White House came to him, John Dean came to him and said, we gave him a list of so-called Nixon's enemies. We want to sick the IRS on all these people. And the head of the IRS, a guy named Johnny Walters, and Shultz said no, which is great. He stood up to the Nixon on that one. But at the same time, they came to him and said, we want the IRS to investigate the hell out of Larry O'Brien. Who was,
now tell that story,
Yeah.
because you've got the long version, which is new.
Yeah, it's all.
And, remind people, Larry O'Brien was head of the Democratic National
Yeah,
Committee
yeah.
that had its headquarters in a building called the Watergate.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who think that the Watergate operation, or at least part of it, was directed at Larry O'Brien.
Right.
Go.
So Nixon wanted to, in his own words, dirty up Larry O'Brien, because he thought correctly that O'Brien was a very skillful operative in the world of politics. And he got John Ehrlichman and Robert Haldeman, his top aides, to lean on Shultz to get the IRS to investigate O'Brien, and they did. They went into a fever state trying to track down what Larry O'Brien's taxes were all about. And Larry O'Brien, had made a consulting agreement with Howard Hughes, the great, billionaire who lived in a kind of isolation, hermit-like in Las Vegas. And so Nixon was convinced that Howard Hughes had moved money through Larry O'Brien illicitly for campaign purposes.
Which is quite possible.
It's quite possible.
And may be true.
Well, the IRS couldn't find it.
Yeah.
And Shultz kept kind of bowing to the pressure from the White House to let this investigation go on. So that was one instance.
No, but there's a moment where there's the power of a tape recording,
Yeah.
where Ehrlichman is on the phone,
Right.
where he's reading from the IRS report. Go into,
Yeah.
because it was standard Nixon, Ehrlichman, Haldeman operating style. But it kind of pins your ears back even these days.
It does indeed. And, what you'll see is it starts with Nixon instructing Ehrlichman and Haldeman and John Dean that the IRS is to be used against his enemies. Right from the get-go, that's his view of the role of the IRS, is to pursue Nixon's opponents. So in this call you allude to, by this point, this IRS investigation of Larry O'Brien has been going on for months. Reports have been written up, and someone at the IRS, not George Shultz, had handed them over to the White House, which shouldn't have been done. And Ehrlichman's sitting there in the White House quoting from these papers to George Shultz and Johnny Walters, the IRS commissioner. And Walters is getting angrier and angrier.
Yeah, but tell them what the papers said.
The papers said there's no flaw here. He's been audited, cleared. There is nothing wrong with Larry O'Brien's tax returns. But, they didn't want to hear that. And so, Walters, who was a very mild-mannered guy, he gets hot under the collar with all this pressure. And Shultz, you can hear him in this conversation trying to mediate between Walters and Ehrlichman. So to me,
just fast forward, because Ehrlichman had to go give this information to Nixon.
Of course.
And that was not a happy day for Ehrlichman or Nixon.
Right. But and this is a little bit of an insight into Shultz, whom, by the way, I admire greatly, and it's a very positive depiction of him. But we all are fallible. I found,
and he's dead.
Yes,
and he's dead. It's great. I suspect, because even if you do something scrupulously, the subject will say, oh, wait a minute, that
course.
wasn't on the 3rd of
Yeah.
March, that was on the 5th
right.
of March or something like that. So,
But, you know, I found this late in the game in his archive at Hoover Institution. There's a letter that he wrote to John Ehrlichman when John Ehrlichman was on trial, right?
yeah.
It was a letter offering to serve as a character witness for John Ehrlichman. I mean, I thought to myself, you know, what were you thinking?
And what was he thinking?
He had a hard time, I think, standing up to people.
Yeah, well, he did. And there's a memorable line in the Nixon tapes, Nixon talking about Shultz, saying he didn't get to be Secretary of the Treasury because of his good blue eyes.
Right.
Now, why did Shultz get to be Secretary of the Treasury for Nixon?
Because he'd been Secretary of Labor, Director of OMB. Nixon liked him, thought he was smart on economic policy.
Yeah, and then it just led him into...
And I guess thought that we'll put George in over at Treasury and he'll do our dirty work for us, which he wasn't willing to do except in this one case.
Yeah. And, okay.
Questions, right?
Yeah, questions. Okay, now please go to the microphone here, you got a clean shot at Phil now. Are you related to George Shultz in
I'm
any
not.
way? Okay,
I'm not.
good. Go ahead. You're cleared to ask a question.
What was Secretary Shultz's view on the Strategic Defense Initiative versus mutual assured destruction? And also, based on your time in Moscow, what did you perceive to be the Soviets' contemporaneous reaction to SDI?
So Shultz started off as a doubter. When he first learned about the Strategic Defense Initiative, he was appalled. He understood that it was technologically implausible and that it would upend the entire kind of arms.
Describe
control.
what it was.
So those
This
of you
was
who
the
don't know,
Star
this
Wars
was,
program.
you know, a space-based defense against Soviet missiles. He tried to talk Reagan out of it. He wasn't brought into the discussions when it was being developed. At the last minute, he learned about it. He tried to talk him out of it. He failed. And at that point, he saluted smartly and defended it, for which he was, I think, rightly criticized by a number of his State Department colleagues. On the Soviet side, it's clear that they were fearful of SDI. I think they didn't really know whether the United States could pull off the technology or not, but they were afraid they were going to have to make huge additional defense investments to try to follow the U.S. in this. And it was clearly one of the reasons that Gorbachev wanted to wind down the Cold War.
Interesting. Thank you.
Next.
Yes. What was the most surprising piece of information that you discovered over the course of your research?
That George Shultz loved to party.
Interesting.
Now explain.
Well, his first wife, Obi, was, maybe some of you knew her, she was very reticent and quiet and modest and almost shy. When she died, a number of years later, he married one of the most gregarious, outgoing people I've ever met, Charlotte. The contrast was like mind-boggling. And Charlotte brought out the fun in George. She was the consummate party organizer.
Well, say who she was. She was a well-known...
She was the director of protocol for the city of San Francisco and the state of California for decades. And if, you know, no one threw a more extravagant party than Charlotte. And I'll describe a scene which I was stunned at. So they're both, he's in his 90s, she's in her 80s. And one day he says, we're going up to City Hall and we're going to do a little skit up there. So I'm watching this skit. George comes out in a jacket and you know, suit. And he stands there, and then lo and behold, being lowered from the ceiling of the City Hall in San Francisco, it's a huge open lobby, comes down Charlotte Shultz yelling, help, 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 you know, damsel in distress. At which point, George rips off his shirt to show a Superman shirt underneath. So it was like, this is the George Shultz I knew as Secretary of State.
Were you working on the book then?
No, it was after the book.
Oh, it was after
Yeah,
the
yeah,
book.
yeah.
Okay.
After I was done with the book, before it was published. Yeah.
Hi, I know you mentioned the issue with Theranos, but is there any, what do you think was his greatest regret during his time as Secretary of State?
He made clear what it was. It was the day that the Marine barracks in Lebanon was bombed. And it was partly at his insistence, against the objections of the Defense Secretary, that the Marines were based in Lebanon. And as you may know, there was a truck bombing of the Marine barracks, and forget 248 Marines, I think, were killed. And he always told me that that was the worst day of his life, because he, George Shultz, had been a Marine and had fought in bloody battles in the Pacific.
Thank you.
And had not stopped the deployment.
No, he favored it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Jim Baker was at least a tactical ally of Shultz, 83 and maybe the years beyond, and Vice President Bush was part of that lunch with Gorbachev. Yet the transition from Shultz to Baker, or Baker taking over from Shultz at the State Department, was probably one of the most vicious and ugly in modern history. And, as Don Oberdorfer wrote, Shultz watched Bush's inauguration in 1989 from the basement of his house amidst packing boxes.
Correct. Were you a State Department person?
No, I'm a big fan of Don Oberdorfer and a fellow journalist, although
well-
I dare not use the word journalist in comparison with Oberdorfer. He was one of a kind.
Well, that makes two of us. I was a huge fan of Don. And when I started covering the State Department, I didn't know what I was doing. And it was on a world trip around the world, and Don took me under his wing, his rival at the New York Times, and helped me enormously. So, yes, this was a very rocky transition. I talk about it a little bit.
In what way did he help you? I mean, this whole business about how competitors also stop the competition at some point for a kind of a larger purpose, or
I think it was,
maybe a smaller purpose.
I think it was just that Don Oberdorfer was a very decent man. Yeah. And what happened at the end of the administration in the handover to Bush was that Baker and Scowcroft, who was Bush's incoming national security advisor, felt that Reagan and Shultz had gone too far, too fast with the Kremlin. And so they wanted to hit the pause button. And this really annoyed Shultz. I describe a scene at Governor's Island. It was the last Gorbachev-Reagan summit meeting, just days before Reagan left office. Bush was there, president-elect. And at a certain point in the meeting on Governor's Island, Gorbachev kind of goes over to Shultz and says, "What's wrong with George Bush?" And Shultz says, "What do you mean?" And Gorbachev said, "Well, he doesn't seem to want to participate in our discussions." So that was a kind of manifestation of what you're talking about. And I think it left a very bitter feeling for Shultz.
After I raised my hand, you mentioned a 28-year-old being young, so thank you guys for thinking that I'm that old. So you emphasize a lot on mutually assured destruction. Do you think that there was a possibility for, if there were no nuclear weapons, the Cold War to still be as ferocious as it actually was?
You know, the arsenals were coming down by the time that Shultz left office. And they've continued to come down under succeeding administrations. But, you know, we're still at a frightening level of, 1,500 nuclear weapons at a minimum that are set to go, and more in the stockpile. So there's still, I left my work on the partnership book very fearful that at some point there could be a nuclear exchange. And you know what? It could come in Ukraine. I certainly wouldn't rule out the possibility that Putin would use a tactical nuclear weapon there at some point.
One of the interesting things Scowcroft said over the years is that deterrence is what's in the heads of your enemy, that it's psychological as much as anything. Do you ever talk with Shultz, or I don't recall anything in the book about why does deterrence work, or what is happening here, or was it just so obvious? They have tens of thousands of destructive weapons, so do we, and so there's deterrence. But you can look at it in a much more sophisticated way, and particularly as the Bush administration now has to deal with Putin and the possibility.
Biden.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, right. And, yes.
Yeah, so, this concept, when you look at it as a lay person, it's mad. And in fact, that's the term for it, mutual assured destruction. At the height of the Cold War, each of the superpowers, had 30, 40,000 nuclear warheads. I got a look at the U.S. nuclear warfighting plan at one point. Not for this book, but for my prior book. I shouldn't have been given access to, but I was. And
no, wait a minute. What do you mean you shouldn't have been given? Well, then why didn't you say, "Oh, don't show this to me"?
Why do you think I
did? You use
that?
It?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but
so
of course you wanted to look at it.
Of course.
Right. Okay.
And I'll give you one data point in it that will tell you everything you need to know. Had there been a global nuclear war with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, there were going to be 78 warheads concentrated on one command and control complex on the outskirts of Moscow. 78 nuclear weapons? What?
Do you know why that happened?
Because both sides, it was like a bidding war at a poker game. You keep trying to call the other side's bluff, and you keep putting more money on the table.
Yeah, but in fact, there's the way it's structured out at Strategic Air Command. They have the targeteers who say, okay, this nuclear weapon gets shot here, and they silo them. And certain people are assigned to do military targets, others economic targets, others leadership targets, and they aren't allowed to talk
to each other.
I know.
Yeah.
They're out there, and this is part of the madness. And so you get things like that. I remember on what was called Kiev at the time, now Kyiv in Ukraine, guess how many nuclear warheads were targeted on that city in Ukraine?
So here's a great little moment. Bill Perry is Secretary of Defense. He's negotiating an agreement with Ukraine and the Soviet Union, or Russia at that point, it was Russia at that point, to dismantle the Ukrainian nuclear arsenal, which was, Soviet weapons, but they had been based in Ukraine. At that point, I believe Ukraine was the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. Bill Perry went into the command room where they would be launched in Kyiv, and there was a map of the United States on the wall. He describes this. It was one of the most kind of disturbing moments of his life, he said. And there on the map were all the targets in the United States that were going to be hit by those missiles.
Good. Thanks, Brad.
Was it at all difficult to show the good and the bad of George Shultz's life, and did that change the dynamic of the book at all?
That goes to a slightly broader question, which is, what's it like writing a biography of a living person? Because most of the book was done before he died, and I just felt there were tough questions that he had to be asked. I asked him about Theranos, about Watergate, about Iran-Contra, about other things. And I knew that was going to disturb him, and I'm sure it did. He was particularly upset when I walked him through what we had learned about the Larry O'Brien affair. But that's what you have to do. I mean, you know, if you're going to write a independent book. But, you know, you have to kind of suck it up a little bit as a person. You know, I admired Shultz in many ways. You know, we spent a lot of time together. And when I would have these tough interviews with him, I knew that they were wounding him. And frankly, the day I went in there with my research assistant to lay out what we'd learned about the Larry O'Brien affair, I thought he might have a heart attack. He was so disturbed by what we were telling him. He'd known it all these years, but nobody else had really ever come to him about it.
Did he ever say to you, "I hope I'm dead when this comes out"?
No, no.
He didn't. He did. There was no expectation
No.
on his part. And the title is "In the Nation's Service." That is a very unusual title. Where'd that come from?
It comes from Princeton University, which Shultz attended. That's their motto. It's now been expanded a little bit in the nation's service and for the welfare of humanity, I think. He went to Princeton, and I think if you sort of sum up his life, there were weak points, there were failures, but if you look at his service across the board, I think it was done as a true American patriot in the service of the nation.
Okay. We're done. Thank you very much. Thanks,
Thank you, Phil and Bob. Copies of Phil's excellent book are available at the checkout desk. He'll be up here signing. Form a line to the right of the table, and help our staff by folding up your chairs.
He was the number 2. Leave that. I'm going to have a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to put it right here.
It's always a best one. But he enjoys his president. Yes, a little bit. Not much.